2 in the morning, somewhere in southern Ontario. Two people carry a black amplifier, head down a narrow stairwell, and out to a van idling in the snow. It is heavier than it looks. The corners are worn to bare wood. It still works. That last part was the entire design brief. The amplifier was not built to sound good, it was built to come back. To survive a rental counter in Toronto, where returned gear arrived damaged, and every repair ate the profit. The name on the front, Traynor. And for a while, that name had a problem of its own. Out on the highway, the letters worked loose. By 1970, the company had redrawn its logo as a parallelogram, partly so the first T and the last R would stop falling off, leaving the word Reno behind. A brand built on things that did not break, quietly losing its grip on its own name. So what happens to a company like that when the rooms it was built for begin to disappear? To answer that, started a repair bench in Toronto in 1963, with a man nobody hired to build anything. This channel documents the Canadian audio companies most people have forgotten: the speaker shops, the amplifier builders, the pressing plants. If that is your kind of history, subscribe and leave a comment. What was the first amplifier you ever played through or stood in front of? Now, back to Toronto and to a repair bench in 1963. In 1963, the center of live music in Toronto ran up and down Yonge Street. Taverns, clubs, and record shops sat shoulder to shoulder for blocks. Jazz in one room, country in the next, rock and roll after midnight. Every one of those rooms needed equipment, and most of the bands playing them could not afford to own it. Long and McQuaid stood on that street, and the store did something most music shops did not. It rented gear out. Renting solved a problem for working musicians and created a new one for the shop. Equipment that went out the door on a Friday came back on a Monday, and it came back broken. In the repair room behind the counter was a bass player named Peter Traynor. He had arrived as a customer and talked his way into a job fixing amplifiers. He had played in bands around the city, at one point alongside Robbie Robertson. Nobody had hired him to design anything. He was hired to keep the rental stock alive. That job is the reason Traynor amplifiers are built the way they are. And it has almost nothing to do with tone. Every repair was labor the store paid for twice, once in parts and once in a rental. It could not book while the amplifier sat on the bench. The cheapest amplifier was not the one with the lowest price. It was the one that never came back. So Traynor started modifying the stock the shop already owned. Heavier hardware, stronger wiring, whatever would survive another weekend in a van. Built like a tank was not a slogan yet. It was a line on a balance sheet. Then a band walked in and asked for something that did not exist. They wanted a public address system they could carry to the gig themselves. In the early 60s, that was close to unthinkable. A singer showed up at a club with a microphone and hoped the room had something to plug it into. Traynor built them a pair of speaker columns, tall, narrow cabinets with several small drivers stacked vertically. An arrangement that pushes a voice down a long room without looping back into the microphone and howling. By the account the company still tells, the columns sat in the middle of the store waiting to be collected, and other acts had ordered their own before the band came back for them. The engineering was not new. Traynor had worked from a reference book of RCA commercial loudspeaker designs from the 1930s. Pre-war hardware thinking pointed at rock and roll. Steve Long, who would later run the company, has put the moment plainly. The folk boom and the arrival of rock had made the singer the most important thing on the stage, and nothing on the market could yet carry a voice that far. Within months, those columns would have a company behind them, and a name taken from a street sign. But the product that would carry that name into every bar in the country was still on the bench, unfinished. And it was not a PA at all. The amplifier still on the bench was a bass amp, and there was a reason for that. Bass gear was the first thing to vanish from the rental stock. Players came in ahead of their Yonge Street bookings, cleaned out the low end, and left the rest on the shelf. So Traynor looked hard at the popular amplifiers of the day, worked out what he would do differently, and built his own. He called it the Dynabass. It was deliberately unglamorous, relatively inexpensive, and made to be handed to a stranger on a Friday night without a second thought. Around Toronto, it was an immediate hit. By the end of 1963, the shop was selling Dynabass heads with matching 15-inch speaker cabinets, alongside the portable columns. 2 product lines, 1 repair bench, and no company to put any of it under. How that was settled is a story the company has been telling for 6 decades. Jack Long, who owned the store, a trumpet player by training, a businessman by circumstance, walked outside with his repairman to work out what the new manufacturing venture should be called. From where the two of them stood on Yonge Street, they could see the sign for Yorkville Avenue. Yorkville Sound. The company was formed with Long as president and Traynor as vice president, and that split was not cosmetic. Long ran the business, Traynor ran the products. A senior figure at the firm has since described him as a kind of mad scientist of the repair room, a man already taking other manufacturers' amplifiers apart, who talked the store's owners into letting him build from nothing instead. The arrangement held because of something less obvious. Long was known for taking large risks and for absorbing what those risks cost, including the pressure that would otherwise have landed on the man at the bench. Traynor was protected from his own company. He was never asked to be a manager. He was asked to keep having ideas. For 13 years, that was enough. It also quietly set the terms of everything that follows. A company organized around one person's instincts works for exactly as long as that person is still standing at the bench. None of that was visible in 1963. What was visible was a rental counter in downtown Toronto, a shop selling amplifiers it had built itself, and orders arriving faster than a back room could fill them. By the middle of the decade, Traynor products were turning up in more and more independent music stores across Canada, sold by a company that, 3 years earlier, had not existed. By 1965, it had a name, a product line, and a border to cross. In 1964, the Dynabass got a catalog number and a new name. The YBA-1 Bassmaster went into production and stayed there into the following decade, and it would end up the most recognized amplifier the company ever built. It was also, by any honest reading, a close relative of amplifiers made elsewhere. The YBA-1s sat near the Fender Bassman and the Marshall JTM-45 in both circuit and character, and Traynor's early standing in Canada rested on selling less expensive versions of the designs those two firms had on the market. That is worth saying once, plainly, and then placing in context. In the mid-60s, the guitar amplifier was not treated as intellectual property. Schematics circulated openly. Much of the early Fender line traced back to reference designs printed in tube manuals, and nearly every builder in the business was working out of the same small library. What separated them was never the drawing. It was what they did with it. What Traynor did with it was overbuild. The transformers, the heavy iron blocks that feed the tubes and hand the signal off to the speaker, were specified well past what the circuit asked for. The chassis was thicker steel than the job required. The cabinets were solid plywood. None of it improved the schematic. All of it improved the odds that the amplifier arrived at the second show in the same condition it left the first. Then the design did something nobody had planned for. The YBA-1 was a bass amplifier. Guitar players bought it anyway. The reason sits inside the power tubes, the glass bottles that handle the final stage of amplification before the signal reaches the speaker. Driven past the level they were built for, tubes do not fail cleanly. They compress, they thicken, and they break up in a way the ear reads as warmth rather than damage. So a guitarist, in a low-ceilinged room off Yonge Street, could take a bass amp to the top of its range and hear something better than what he had walked in carrying. A margin of safety meant to protect the hardware had accidentally produced a sound. The company incorporated in 1965 and pointed itself at the United States. Soon after came a guitar amplifier, the YGA-1, and a powered PA mixer, the YVM-1. The first time a band could buy its backline and its vocal system from the same Canadian catalog. By the middle of the decade, the Guitar Mate arrived, and the line stopped being a bass amp with accessories and became a range. And underneath the range sat the number that actually explains the growth. Traynor was never the best amplifier a Canadian musician could buy. It was the closest thing to the best that a Canadian musician could afford. British and American gear crossed the border carrying freight, duty, and a distributor's margin, and arrived priced for someone who was not playing 5 sets a night for the door. Traynor was built 4 hours from most of its customers, sold through the shop that rented to them, and costed for a working player rather than an enthusiast. That was not a marketing position. In a market the size of Canada's, it was the only position available. The catalog grew around that logic, and it grew by player rather than by category. The Guitar Mate, a 12-inch combo of modest power, went to the guitarist who needed to be heard over a drummer in a room holding 200 people. The Studio Mate took the same idea into an unusual sealed cabinet fitted with 4 8-inch speakers, and found its way to players who wanted tightness rather than volume. The Bass Master went where it had always gone, behind the person holding down the bottom end 6 nights a week. Which brings up the story every Canadian musician of a certain age will tell about these amplifiers, and which should be labeled for what it is. Legend has it that Pete Traynor tested new models by throwing them off a 2-story roof. There is no record confirming it. It has been repeated for 60 years, because it explains something the specifications cannot, and because everyone who owned one found it plausible. What can be said without a legend is this. The Traynor models built through the 60s and 70s are recognized as some of the most durable tube amplifiers ever produced, and enough of them survived intact that they are still being bought, sold, and repaired today, half a century after the last one left the line. The person responsible for that was not, by any account, running the company. Jack Long, who would later describe his partner in terms that had nothing to do with engineering. That Traynor had an uncanny knack for knowing what people were going to want 5 years before they wanted it. The portable PA had proved that. So had the bass amplifier that turned into a guitar amplifier without asking permission. By the end of the decade, that instinct would be tested in front of 20,000 people at the top of the city. On a single afternoon, in a stadium, with the whole backline wearing the same name. On the afternoon of Saturday, September 13, 1969, roughly 20,000 people filed into Varsity Stadium on the University of Toronto's St. George campus. What they had bought tickets for was a revival, a bill of first-generation rock and roll acts put together by 2 Toronto promoters, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Bo Diddley, Gene Vincent, Jerry Lee Lewis, Junior Walker, and the All-Stars, Alice Cooper, somewhere in the middle of the running order, and the Doors, booked to close. 12 hours of music in a single day. What the crowd did not know when the gates opened was that John Lennon was coming. The Plastic Ono Band had been assembled at short notice, and the set it played in that stadium was its first performance anywhere. The recording was released before Christmas. It became one of the most documented afternoons in Canadian music. Film crews worked the stage all day, and the footage has been cut and recut ever since, which means that in a great many frames shot from the front of that stage, sitting behind some of the most photographed musicians alive, is equipment built in Toronto. By the company's own account, the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival ran on a Yorkville PA system with a full Traynor backline. 6 years earlier, that company had been a repair room behind a store counter. But the stadium was the exception, and everyone in Pickering's predecessor factory understood it. A festival of that size happened once. It sold no amplifiers on its own. What sold amplifiers was smaller, dirtier, and repeated itself 6 nights a week. And most of it was happening within walking distance of where Pete Traynor had built his first speaker column. Through the 60s and into the 70s, Yonge Street carried live music in a density that is difficult to picture now. Taverns and clubs stood alongside record shops for block after block. The Town Tavern, the Zanzibar, the Colonial, Club Blue Note. A person walking that strip on a weeknight could find jazz in one room, soul in the next, country further down, and rock and roll after midnight, and could buy the record on the way home from Sam the Record Man or A&A. Every one of those rooms had a stage. Every stage needed amplification, and almost none of the bands filling them were carrying gear they had paid for outright. Then, in the summer of 1971, the province changed the size of the audience by legislation. On July 28, 1971, Ontario enacted a law lowering the drinking age from 21 to 18, part of a broader package of age of majority reforms moving across North America at the time. It did not phase in gradually. By the first week of September, senior students at Jarvis Collegiate in downtown Toronto were spending their lunch hour having a legal drink at a pub near the school, and the Toronto Star was there to write it down. 3 years of the population had just been handed the right to walk into a licensed room. For the taverns along Yonge and every strip like it in the province, that was not a cultural shift. It was arithmetic. More paying customers meant more nights of live entertainment worth booking. More bookings meant more bands able to survive on the circuit. More bands meant more backline. And the backline, more often than not, was Canadian, because Canadian was what the store down the street rented and sold. For roughly 8 years, a company that built equipment for working musicians operated in a province that had just legislated more work. Nothing about that arrangement was designed to last. But before it came apart, a shop in Toronto would settle a question that had nothing to do with amplifiers at all, and quietly decide what the floor of a concert stage looks like everywhere. For the next 50 years, everything the company had sold so far stood behind the band. That is what a backline is. The row of amplifiers and speaker cabinets lined up across the rear of a stage, aimed out at the room. It solves the audience's problem completely. It does almost nothing for the people playing. A band standing in front of its own equipment hears the back of that equipment, the drums at close range, and whatever the room throws back at it. The singer has it worst. The vocal system faces the audience, which is the entire point of it, and that leaves the one person carrying the melody with the least reliable seat in the building. For most of the 60s, that was simply understood to be part of the job. Musicians solved it before manufacturers did. Somebody working a room with a pair of Yorkville columns tipped one onto its side, propped it up with bricks until it pointed back at the stage, and got a rough version of what the crowd was hearing. It was a poor solution. Unstable, badly aimed, taking up floor space nobody had. It was also exactly the right idea. Traynor watched it being done and built the object it was reaching for. An angled cabinet, low and wedge-shaped, made from the start to sit on the floor and fire upward at a performer. In a tavern off Yonge Street, a singer working the last set of the night could finally hear her own voice come back at her from 2 feet away instead of guessing at it. Who arrived at the idea first is the wrong question, and it belongs to a different documentary. What matters is what happened to it afterward. The wedge monitor did not stay a Toronto answer to a Toronto problem. It became the assumption. It sits on the floor of every club, theater, and festival stage built since, in every country, under performers who have never heard the name of the shop that first put one into production. A repair room in Toronto had helped settle what the floor of a stage looks like, and then went uncredited for it. That is the shape of the company's influence in these years: wide, physical, and largely invisible. The commercial reach grew alongside it. By the middle of the 60s, Traynor equipment had moved well past the store that created it and was appearing in independent music shops across the country. The company's own materials record the names that came with it: Chuck Berry, John Lennon, Eric Clapton, Jeff Baxter, and Steve Miller, among the players who ended up standing in front of Traynor gear. Those are the names a manufacturer prints in a catalog. The business underneath them was quieter and far more Canadian. The cover band working a hotel lounge in northern Ontario, the wedding act outside Montreal, the high school dance in a gymnasium in Nova Scotia. None of those bookings made a magazine. All of them bought amplifiers. This was the market the title of this story refers to, not the stadium. The room with a taped-down power bar, a stage barely deep enough for a drum kit, and a door that opens straight onto a parking lot. Repeated across the province, and then across the country, night after night, for most of a decade. And then there is the part of the map that stayed empty. Traynor crossed into the United States. It never crossed the United States. Distribution concentrated in the American Northeast and the Northern Midwest, the states within about a day's drive of the border, and it largely stopped there. The proof is still sitting in shops today. The vintage Traynor amplifiers that surface on the American used market come overwhelmingly out of those same regions, 6 decades later, because that is as far as the company ever reached. So the picture at the height of it is stranger than it looks. A manufacturer with a stadium's worth of publicity, equipment on stages in several countries, and a piece of stage design about to go worldwide, attached to a commercial footprint that was, in plain terms, regional, dominant at home. A visitor everywhere else. That was survivable for as long as home stayed the way it was. It did not. The company had built its name on things that did not break. What broke first was everything around them. The first thing that went wrong had nothing to do with music. A Canadian manufacturer selling into the United States is running 2 businesses at once. There is the business of building the product, which Yorkville was good at, and there is the business of what the product costs by the time it clears the border, which no factory controls. Through the 1970s, that second business turned against them. Available accounts point to import surtaxes on the American side, and alongside them, a Canadian dollar that spent long stretches of the decade at or above parity with the American one. The equipment did not change. The price, on the other side of the border, did. That undid the one advantage the company had spent a decade building. Traynor had never sold itself as the best. It had sold itself as the amount of quality a working player could actually reach. And reach was a function of price. Take the price advantage away, and what remains is a Canadian amplifier competing on even terms against British and American brands with longer histories, larger dealer networks, and better-known logos, in a country where nobody had grown up hearing the name. There is a particular cruelty in the way that pressure arrived. Every problem the company had solved to that point was a problem you could solve with material. Cabinets splitting on the road, use thicker plywood. Chassis flexing, use heavier steel. Transformers running hot, specify bigger iron. The entire design philosophy was built on the assumption that if you spend more on the object survives. There is no gauge of steel that fixes an exchange rate. The second thing that went wrong was in the building. In 1976, Peter Traynor left Yorkville Sound. The reason given was his back, which had deteriorated to the point where the work was no longer possible. He was in his mid-30s. 13 years earlier, he had walked into a repair room as a bass player with no engineering credentials and no mandate to design anything. In between, he had put a portable PA system into the hands of bands who had never owned one, built a bass amplifier that guitarists took over, and had a hand in deciding what a stage monitor is. Then he stopped, and he did not come back to it. He lived quietly for the next 40 years. He died in May 2016. The company he left behind was structurally sound and financially intact, and it now had a specific hole in it. Jack Long had spent 13 years protecting one man's ability to have ideas. That arrangement had produced everything the brand was known for. It had also meant the product line ran on instinct rather than process. And instinct does not transfer with a set of keys. The third thing that went wrong was the law changing its mind. The drinking age Ontario had lowered in 1971 did not survive the decade. As the 70s wore on, concern grew that the reform had pushed alcohol further down into the high schools than intended, and that drunk driving charges among young drivers had climbed sharply. In May 1978, the province brought forward legislation raising the drinking age to 19, part of a wider package of liquor reforms. Anyone who had turned 18 before the 1st of January 1979 kept the right to drink. Everyone behind them lost it. The barrooms of Ontario had been given an audience by statute in 1971. 8 years later, a portion of that audience was taken back the same way. For a licensed room booking live music 6 nights a week, the change did not need to be dramatic to matter. Those rooms ran on thin margins and full seats. The bands filling them ran on thinner margins still. A fee for the night, split several ways, against gas and strings in a van. Remove a slice of the paying crowd, and the weakest bookings stop being worth putting on. The tavern shortens the week. The band takes the shorter week, or stops. None of this appeared on a balance sheet in Pickering's predecessor factory as a single event. It appeared as amplifiers not being bought by people who no longer had a reason to buy them. And then the manufacturing itself changed. In 1980, Yorkville ceased tube amplifier production. 17 years of tubes, then none. It was not a scandal, and it was not a collapse. It was a decision made by a company reading its own numbers. Tube amplifiers are expensive to build, slow to assemble, heavy to ship. And by 1980, the market was moving hard towards solid-state designs that were lighter, cheaper, and, for most buyers, entirely adequate. The circuits that had carried the brand for 17 years were now the least commercially rational thing in the catalog. So the line that started in a repair room behind a store counter, in the same city, on the same street, the line built for the rental returns, the one every legend about the brand attaches to, stopped. The name did not stop. The name carried on for another decade on solid-state products, and the company went on growing. But everything the word Traynor had meant to a musician standing on a small stage in Ontario was, from that year forward, something that had already happened. What replaced the tubes was not transistors. It was a different company. Through the 80s, Yorkville turned its manufacturing toward professional sound reinforcement. The PA systems, powered cabinets, and mixing equipment that go into venues rather than into the back of a musician's van. That decision worked, which produces the central irony of this story. The firm survived. It survived by moving away from the product that had created it. The amplifiers were the reason there was a company worth saving, and saving the company meant building fewer of them, and eventually, none. There was pressure from outside as well, though it should be stated carefully. Across the 70s and 80s, the instrument amplifier business as a whole shifted toward large-scale offshore production, and a mid-sized manufacturer building in Ontario was working against a cost structure it could not match on volume. How much of Traynor's decline that accounts for specifically is not something the available record settles. What the record does show is what happened to the rooms. Beginning in the late 1970s, the Yonge Street Strip stopped being the center of music in Toronto. Tastes in live entertainment changed. The city spread outward, and the audience spread with it. The clubs that had stood shoulder to shoulder for blocks began closing, or converting to something else, or simply going quiet on weeknights. Today, only a handful of venues remain on a street that once held dozens. The same contraction happened, at different speeds, in every city and small town running on the same arrangement. And that is the actual death in this story, not a brand, a trade. There had been a way to make a living in this country playing an instrument well enough to be booked and not well enough to be famous. 5 sets a night, 6 nights a week, a hotel lounge in one town and a tavern in the next, a van, a road case, a backline. Almost nobody got rich at it and nobody pretended otherwise, but there was enough of it that a person could do it for years and call it a job. That is the thing that went away, and no company decision caused it. Traynor amplifiers had been engineered, specifically and deliberately, for that life. Built to be handed to a stranger. Built to survive a stairwell. Built to come back. When the life ended, the design brief ended with it. The brand went out slowly after that. The catalog thinned. The tube line had already stopped, and the solid-state products carried the name forward into the following decade. Competent, reasonably priced, and largely unremarkable, which was precisely the problem. The reputation had been built on a specific promise made to a specific kind of musician. Take away the tubes. Take away the founder. Take away the circuit that guitar players had adopted on their own. And what remained was a name on a box, competing against every other name on a box. By the early 1990s, Yorkville retired the Traynor brand outright to concentrate on sound systems. No announcement, no final model. The name simply stopped being printed. Its founder had walked out of the building most of 2 decades earlier. Now the word he had put on the front of an amplifier was gone from the catalog as well. And here is the strangest part of the entire decline. While the name was disappearing, the factory was getting larger. The company had moved from the back room to a plant in downtown Toronto, then to bigger premises in Scarborough, and by the 90s into the facility in Pickering it occupies today, a building on a scale the repair room could not have imagined, turning out professional audio equipment under a different name entirely. The sign got bigger. The word came off the amplifiers. So by the early 90s, if a person wanted to find the name Traynor in Canada, there was one reliable place to look. And it was not the new stock in a music store. It was the used wall, the back corner of a consignment shop in a strip mall somewhere in Ontario, a head cabinet on the floor with 2 others stacked on top of it, vinyl covering worn gray along the edges, a handwritten price tag taped to the front panel, priced to move because nobody was collecting these yet, and the shop wanted the floor space back. Dust across the top. 20 years old, sold secondhand twice, carried in and out of rooms that no longer existed, by bands that no longer existed, for an audience that had been legislated into those rooms and legislated back out again. Still working. That is where the story should end, and for almost any other brand it would. A name retired, a market gone, the product surviving only as somebody else's used gear on somebody else's floor. But an amplifier that refuses to break has a way of outlasting the argument for retiring it. Those cabinets sat in shops right through the 90s. They kept working. People kept plugging into them and paying almost nothing for the privilege and telling each other what they had found. And eventually somebody in Pickering looked at a name that had been switched off and started asking whether it needed to stay off. In 2000, Yorkville Sound switched the name back on. The product that did it was the YCV40, Custom Valve 40, a 40-watt all-tube combo, and the first Traynor guitar amplifier built around tubes in 20 years. By the company's own account, it took an Editor's Pick Award from Guitar Player magazine the following year. What followed was a catalog running in 2 directions at once. Reissues of the amplifiers people had been hunting for secondhand, and new tube designs that had never existed before. A line of small lunchbox heads, and for bass players, a 300-watt all-tube amplifier that would have been unthinkable in the Dynabass era. That reads like a straightforward victory, and in commercial terms it was. But it is worth being precise about what came back, because it was not the thing that had left. The Traynor of 1968 had sold reliability to people who could not afford a breakdown. The Traynor of 2000 sold tube tone to a country with a fraction of the stages left to use it on. The product returned. The world it had been designed for did not. What made the return possible had been happening quietly on those used walls for a decade. Traynor had never broken through with American collectors the way the British imports did, and the reason was that empty map. The distribution had never reached far enough for the name to become mythology. In the vintage market, mythology is what sets the price. So while comparable amplifiers of the same era climbed, Traynors sat well below them. The same circuits, the same decade, the same heavy iron, priced like used furniture. The company's commercial failure had turned into something else entirely. A player who could not afford a vintage American or British amplifier could afford a Traynor. Half a century of hardware built to survive a rental counter was still working, still cheap, and still reaching people who had no other way in. Whatever the brand had lost in prestige, it returned decades late as access. And because they were cheap and built like freight, people opened them up. Traynor sits among the most modified vintage amplifiers on the market. Rather than treat that as damage, the company has said plainly that it regards the hot rodding as part of its heritage, an unusual position for a manufacturer, and an honest one for a brand that began with a repairman modifying other people's gear. The people came to their endings in order. In 2014, Jack Long was appointed to the Order of Canada for his contribution to the Canadian music industry, and specifically for founding both Long and McQuaid and Yorkville Sound. In May 2016, Pete Traynor died. He had been away from the business for 40 years. In 2024, Jack Long died at 95. Yorkville Sound remains owned by the Long family, which leaves the amplifiers, and one of them closes the circle. Traynor still sells a bass amplifier called the Bassmaster, the name that started everything in 1963. The current version is the Bassmaster 12 Mobile, a full-sized bass combo with a 12-inch speaker, 32 pounds, running more than 6 hours on a single battery charge. The company describes it as ideal for busking. Read that against the beginning. The original was built to be loaded into a van at 2 in the morning and carried up the back stairs of a tavern. The current one is built to be carried onto a sidewalk, because it no longer assumes there is a room at the end of the trip, or a promoter, or a door charge, or an audience old enough to be let in. The name survived. The gig it was named after did not. The company that makes it is still in Pickering. By its own description, Yorkville Sound designs and manufactures a line of Canadian-made tube and solid-state instrument amplifiers under the Traynor name for Canada, the United States, and export markets. Published company figures for the plant vary, somewhere in the range of 200 to 250 employees, in a facility given variously as 150,000 to 225,000 square feet. That is a larger operation than the one that built the Dynabase, by an enormous margin. It is not, in any sense that matters to this story, the same enterprise. What ended was never the manufacturer. What ended was the trade the manufacturer existed to equip. The country did not lose an amplifier company. It lost the ordinary, unglamorous possibility of earning a living by playing an instrument in a licensed room in your own town, 6 nights a week, in front of people who had come out specifically to hear it. Traynor built the hardware for that life more carefully than anyone needed it built, and the hardware is still here. The life is not. On a weekday morning in Pickering, a plywood cabinet moves down the line. A steel chassis is bolted into it, and the badge goes on straight, the same shape that was drawn so the letters would stop falling off on the highway. See you in the next one.